Can everybody hear me all right? Great. All right, well, welcome to the 2025 Environmental and Natural Resource Symposium, and thank you for joining us at the Connection Conference here at Ohio Wesleyan University. I would also like to thank our panelists for their valuable contributions to today's talk, and to thank the Woltemade Center for sponsoring this event. So the Woltemade Center hosts this event every year as a way to highlight the connection between the environment and economics. And the title of today's talk is Efficient Conservation, which is really about how we can apply economic thinking and the mindset of efficiency to protect the environment, regardless of our specific job title or field of study. And so I believe personally that connection with the environment is an integral and essential part of the human experience, yet ecosystems across the globe are in danger every day of degradation due to human activity. And so the question then becomes, how do we protect the environment? How do we conserve the environment when that protection requires real and financial resources, yet government budgets are being cut and regulations are being removed? Today's speakers are going to share their perspectives on how we can use data to make decisions that are going to achieve the greatest environmental impact with limited resources. In addition to both speakers working in fields related to the environment, both also attended colleges that are sister institutions with Ohio Wesleyan University in the Ohio 5 and the Great Lakes College Association. So both speakers will also comment on the paths that led them from being undergraduate students at liberal arts colleges, like many in this room are today, to where they are now in their careers. So speaking first will be Nicole Burns. Nicole is a landscape and conservation biologist for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. She earned her bachelor's in biology from Denison University, my alma mater as well, and her master's degree in biology from the University of Guam, where she researched coral reef conservation techniques. In her role at the FWC, she develops tools and resources to inform and prioritize conservation efforts across the state, while coordinating the connection and collaboration of conservation efforts across FWC's divisions with other partners in the conservation community. Immediately following Nicole's presentation, we will hear from Elizabeth Schuster. Elizabeth is an agricultural and environmental economist with almost 25 years of experience in sustainability, conservation, agriculture, and research in the United States and internationally. She's the founder and CEO of a boutique environmental economics consulting firm that helps organizations gain clarity and have more impact through strategic planning, community engagement, and applied economics research. Previously, she was an environmental economist with the Nature Conservancy. After hearing both Nicole and Elizabeth share their perspectives, we will open up the symposium to questions from the audience. And so without any additional fanfare, it is my great pleasure to hand the microphone over to Nicole Burns.
I'll talk right here. Okay. Maybe now? Okay, fantastic. Definitely want to hear what I have to say. So, landscape conservation biologist for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I, just listening to what Professor Georgic was saying, absolutely resonated a lot with everything that I do in terms of making the most of our conservation work with the smallest amount of resources. Economic efficiency is very key in terms of what we try to accomplish. So without further ado, I'll get right into it. But first, a little bit about me. So as was mentioned, I went to Denison University, go Big Red. Not as popular around here, I know, but I got my Bachelor of Arts in Biology and Spanish as a double major, and of course got to enjoy all the amazing things that are afforded to us with a liberal arts education. Absolutely fantastic, very wonderful 4 years of my time there. And what I wanted to specifically highlight was, not to be too cliche, a little bit of a catalyst in terms of moving me towards my career path, was a semester abroad with the School for Field Studies. at the Center for Marine Resource Studies on South Caicos and the Turks and Caicos Islands. And it was, at the time, a little bit of a different opportunity and a little bit of a different path than a lot of people were taking. I wasn't sure if I would enjoy going and doing this very environmental sustainable program and showering once a week, but it turned out that it was an incredible, really formative experience. The School for Field Studies has amazing programs all over the world with environmental sustainability focuses, and I had a truly incredible experience and wanted to just suggest that as something where when you're thinking about what you want to do, where you're trying to go, and where you're trying to find your career path, keeping your mind open to perhaps some of the little more out there experiences, and they might just be the best ones. And then I moved to the island of Guam in the middle of the Pacific, also a little bit of a different journey than a lot of people. I think the most often comment was, what is or where is Guam? So after figuring all of that out, I moved there. I got my Master of Science in Biology with a research concentration in coral reef restoration. And again, maybe not the most first thing you think of when you're trying to figure out where you're going to go to grad school, but my suggestion again to all of you when you're trying to think of what your next path is keeping your mind open and trying to find the right path that suits you. It might not be the most conventional thing. It might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you're thinking about grad schools or programs in the US, in the mainland US, but this was a really incredible experience, and I got to scuba dive and travel all over the Pacific and in parts of Asia and do some really incredible research with my advisor, Dr. Lori Raimundo, and really, really incredible things. So just keep at it, keep your mind open to the different opportunities that might be out there. So now what I do in terms of natural resource management with the state government. So like I said, I'm a landscape conservation biologist with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or FWC. I specifically work for the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute Division, and pretty much anything that has to do with natural resources in the state of Florida, we have a hand in it in terms of working with, managing, conserving, regulating. So this is just a snapshot from our website, and that's just a few examples of the different types of things that we are working with. And a large part of my job is connecting and collaborating, and I'm probably going to say that an obnoxious amount of times in this presentation, but that is a huge part of what government, and what my job specifically, but I would say government conservation work is working with other partners and trying to get the most bang for your buck as it is in terms of your conservation actions. And so this is just a small smattering of different organizations that I work with, whether they're federal or state or university or private and NGO. I was working with these groups. I was reaching out to them, trying to get their data to either use in the tools and resources that I was working with and creating and designing for conservation and management, or just working with them to help collaborate on different conservation projects. So lots of different connecting, collaborating. And then another thing that I do, I work on our landscape conservation support team. And so the general objective of this team is to integrate the concepts of landscape conservation throughout our agency. And that means trying to upscale and get the biggest conservation actions, get that greatest conservation lift on the biggest scale possible. And so I act as the co-lead for this team. We are sort of a liaison. And we work with our regional C3 teams. C3 stands for Connect, Collaborate, and Conserve. And working with those teams to taking all of their needs and their work that they're doing up to our vision team, which is our agency's executive leadership. And so sort of acting as a liaison to make sure that we can get that work done. And lastly, I also work on our climate resiliency team. And so the objective of this team is integrating the concepts of climate resiliency and adaptation throughout our agency, really integrating it into the work that we do. Specifically, I'm working with our agency leadership on energy conservation and carbon footprint reduction throughout the agency. And the path for that I took was working on integrating recycling initiatives throughout the agency, as well as electric vehicle integration into our fleet. So now, some challenges and constraints, because it's not all roses, unfortunately. And again, we're talking about economic efficiency. So trying to think about some of the challenges that we face with that. And I think if you talk to, again, where I come from in terms of state government conservation work, these sort of things I think are some of the biggest things that you'll think of, and it's really hard to even prioritize one or the other. They're also interlinked like this. Number one, of course, the funds. Funding to actually do the work that we need to do, funding to get those grants and to actually do the on-the-ground implementation of our conservation work, or the funds to hire staff, the funds to hire them and pay them compensatory wages to actually retain them, getting that experienced, dedicated, qualified people to do this incredible, really important work that we need to do. And that, of course, is all interlinked when we have changing administrations. And this is across the board. Whenever there's a changeover, they're going to have different priorities in terms of where they want to allocate their funding. And that funding, their priorities for where they want to do that might not necessarily align with our conservation priorities. And so all of this really creates a general sense of uncertainty in terms of, are we going to be able to get the money that we need to do that work? And are we going to have that money to hire the staff that we need to do that work? And this, again, this is across political parties. This is not a political comment or anything like that, no matter who's there. And this is sort of on a general federal scale. No matter who's in office, no matter what's going on, they have different priorities, and that can and will affect if we are able to do the work that we need to do. And that, for example, dictates the money that's going to a lot of different federal agencies that give us conservation funds. For example, NIFWF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are huge supporters through different grants and conservation trust funds that fund our conservation programs. And like I said, that also impacts who we hire and who we're able to hire. When I very first started in this position about 6.5 years ago, I was on a grant-funded position that was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And my agency relies heavily on grant-funded positions to be able to do our work. And so if we're not able to get those grants and get those funds because of whatever's going on where they want to dedicate that money, then we're not able to hire the incredible staff to do invasive species management and control the pythons in the Everglades, which that's a small one for the record. Or being able to work on fisheries regulation and management, or just have the people that we need to build those connections with all of the different things that we have to do. So a lot of challenges there. But we move on, we carry on, and we try and do the best that we can with what we do have. And so a couple of examples of that I work on specifically with these data-driven, science-based conservation practices. Again, when I was first brought on to this position, it was my duty to come up with a design and a plan for creating these ecological report cards. And so the goal was to come up with a way to very easily explain and disseminate the information of the ecological condition of how our natural resources are doing. And so we came up with a list of prioritized ecosystems, for example, freshwater lakes, rivers and streams, forested wetlands, non-forested wetlands, lots of different upland forest types and things like that, and come up with a list of indicators that can literally create a full picture and literally indicate the condition of these resources. And so that was reaching out to all those organizations that I listed earlier, reaching out to them, grabbing their data, doing different statistical analyses, and coming up with that big picture on, are our ecosystems doing good or not, and how can we do better? So that was one thing that I do. And then another example is working with a lot of different spatial data. And so this sort of is newer for me, but it's a little bit of a different path, a little bit of a different perspective. It was working with those as the co-lead for that landscape conservation support team, working with those C3 teams, trying to find ways to focus in and find areas that we can do the most collaborative work and the most connections to get that greatest conservation lift. And so that was taking a lot of different spatial data sets, whether it's the different prioritized ecosystems and all these different colors here, whether it's looking at sea level rise indices or development indices, trying to find those niches with connecting different corridors, wildlife migration corridors, looking at lands that Florida currently already has in management and in conservation, and lands that we want to try and acquire to bring into conservation status so that they're supported and withheld from future development and protected for our wildlife. And sort of metaphorically trying to connect the dots where our different team members are working and have already their divisions priorities for conservation actions and things like that, and find all of the overlap of that. And that would be then a suggestion in terms of where we can concentrate our efforts to get that greatest conservation lift. So I think, generally speaking, it's a huge part of what I do, and I think what state government conservation is just that, working together, having connection, collaboration, and trying to get the greatest conservation lift with the sort of, most efficient way. Because of that, all that uncertainty that we have of when the money's coming, where the money's coming from, are we gonna have the people to do it? It's finding the ways to do the most with probably the littlest amount. So that's what I have for you today. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Nicole, and really appreciated that talk. Now, to complement Nicole's perspective, as a state government employee, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Schuster to the lectern to discuss how she views this problem as an environmental economics consultant, more so from the private sector. So, welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, everybody. So I think when you hear my presentation, the thing that's going to be going through your head is, I thought they said this was about efficiency, and nothing Elizabeth is saying sounds efficient. So what I would like to be in the back of your mind, and the take-home message to be, that a lot of what I'm suggesting is not efficient in the short term. It creates more work in the short term, but that short-term investment is setting us up for more impact in the future. So, looking back, the way conservation nonprofits prioritized conservation was very quantitative, looking at ecological targets. But before 2010, they were literally just saving one parcel at a time without thinking about how all the parcels connected. And so it was very novel around 2010 when they realized that we should be looking more at the landscape scale, more at the watershed scale. For those of you who are from this area, this is the Muskingum watershed. Anyone who went to a conference in 2010 was getting a presentation on ecoregions or watersheds. But notably, there was still no talk about how humans fit into the planning process and the prioritization process. Well, around this time, here, let me back up. This is my 25-year anniversary from graduating from Oberlin College. I got my bachelor's degree in environmental studies, which today I think is a sustainability degree. It's how it was framed then. And I waited 10 years to go to grad school. And the reason I went to grad school is I realized that sustainability alone wasn't going to work without being founded on economic insights. So I got my grad degree in, as he said, ag and environmental economics. So I say this to cue us up. Around this time I was in grad school. And so when I graduated from grad school in 2012 was around the time where there was a collective realization across conservation nonprofits that, wait a minute, maybe we should think about human beings when we're prioritizing. And what do decision makers care most about? They care about money. So we really need to be making the economic case at the same time that we're doing the ecological prioritization. And so by chance, I get a job with the Nature Conservancy. I'm their second ever environmental economist. And so my career path timeline happened to align with this national timeline where out of the clear blue, everyone really cared about environmental economics. And so what did my job look like back in the early days? I did a study to see whether or not if you plant a native pollinator strip next to an ag field, whether farmers would see an increase in revenues. And then I also did an ecosystem service valuation on that. That is southern New Jersey. That's Cape May Meadows. Now, this had been done before. People were already at this point putting a dollar value on nature. What was unique about that project is this was a $15 million restoration project by the Army Corps of Engineers. And so it was among the first that showed the before and the after impact, the change, because of that restoration. And so we were able to find that it had a $9 million benefit in terms of reducing flooding, and it had a tourism impact as well. And this, I say, like, I wasn't unique, though. At the end of the day, this was common. This was becoming trendy during this period. How can we put a dollar value on nature to inform decision making? And it's the premise idea that, well, if we can show those homeowners that they're having less flooding because of that wetland, if we can show those communities that they are getting clean drinking water because of forested floodplains, then maybe they'll pay for it. But I don't think anyone really thought this through, because when you're reaching out to partners, Nicole talked a lot about collaboration. When your first conversation with new partners is you're benefiting from nature, and so you should be paying for it, turned out, in hindsight, that didn't go very well. It wasn't a foundation for a relationship based on trust. And sure enough, after fully implementing these ecosystem service valuation approaches and putting a dollar value in nature, fast forward, and it didn't help that much. We're not meeting our conservation targets globally around biodiversity, water quality, carbon sequestration, air quality. So why has this been harder than expected? I think the obvious one, as Nicole mentioned, we know that there's not enough funding. That's a factor, but it's these other things. It turns out that this overemphasis only on quantitative data was removing the human element too much. And it was meaning that we weren't designing interventions that were relevant for communities, so we weren't getting their buy-in, and we weren't basing these relationships on trust. It became very transactional if it was only about money. And at the end of the day, a cost-benefit analysis only goes so far. You can show that investing in this forest or this wetland, that the benefits are higher than the cost, but not all decision makers are then going to protect that wetland just because there is an economic case for it. It turns out that doesn't necessarily change decisions. So we have an example. There are a lot of mayors across the US who are doing these climate action plans, and they're really working hard to mitigate climate change and reduce carbon emissions. And if you look at who's doing this, we have the mayor of Cleveland, we have, I think they're doing this in Columbus as well. We have my friends over in Tucson, Arizona. They're not doing it because of an economic argument. They're doing it because they value it. They value an equitable approach for their communities. I was trying to decide if I should give another example, but I don't want to go into the weeds. And then we also are finding that the relationships, the collaboration, that community building means that people are more likely to make a decision based on what you're saying. Further, we found that this exclusively quantitative approach didn't look at the distribution of the benefits. So this article came out by the director of the economics department over at Ohio State University last year, and she did show that our tendency in environmental economics to just look at the total impact actually has accidentally furthered racial inequities, because it hasn't looked at who's benefiting. And we can see examples of this, that the benefits weren't distributed. There was a study on access to flood infrastructure, and we have found that Black communities across the country have had less access to FEMA dollars and are getting hit more by flooding. And locally here in Cleveland, we have found that when you overlay the places where the tree canopy is most degraded, so where the tree canopy is almost gone, it's a direct overlay with neighborhoods that have a history of redlining, where there are more vulnerable populations in terms of more elderly and more children, where there are lower incomes. So we consistently see this discrepancy in the distribution of benefits. So I love this slide. This was actually published in Science. So this is a published article, though she only published up through there, and I added on this last piece. And the reason I like this is because it shows how it's changed over the time. You know, way back, it was all about national parks and preservation of land. And then we moved into, let's say, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, so it was about reducing pollution. And then we moved into the economic value and having to show that nature benefits people. And then we moved into this more systems level resilience framework. And I believe we are now in a new phase that it's about collaboration, participatory processes, and equity. And I'll just say real quick, it doesn't mean we've stopped caring about the other phases. Like, the Clean Water Act is still important in terms of reducing pollution. It just means that that alone wasn't sufficient. So I would say they're additive, not that we've completely lost the previous phases. In this new phase, I'm just going to give two quick examples of what this looks like in my work today as someone who works and does strategic planning with conservation nonprofits in the state of Ohio. And there's one example, Cleveland Tree Coalition. They did use an evidence-based approach in terms of choosing where trees go and how to plant them, but that alone wasn't enough. They weren't going to have impact working alone, so they created this coalition of 50 members. And part of my work with them was getting all 50 members in a room in a retreat to agree on shared goals. And they did. They came up with these shared goals. And then the next step being aligning those goals with actual community needs. Do communities care about public health, about walkable communities, about housing, aligning it there? I also have done some climate action planning with cities in Ohio, and there we were collecting data. We were collecting evidence from communities on what they cared about, and what we found is we wanted to reach communities that hadn't been reached before in these processes, and we invited them and they just didn't show up. Like, how do you even get them to show up? So it turned out it wasn't just about the data, but it was about the trust and having a community member invite them and choosing a location that was accessible. And they're only going to show up if they think that you're going to listen. So then we had to prove to them that we were going to incorporate their feedback into the plan. And so I really wanted to highlight that that's kind of a big change, is we started off with only quantitative data, and now I would say the biggest change is that in conservation, when they make decisions, there's a greater recognition that the qualitative data matters. But not all qualitative data is good. You have to design it at the beginning so that you're collecting the right data, and you have to know who you're talking to, and there has to be some quality control in the data, and you have to use methods of analysis. And I highlighted that fifth one. It all falls apart. It doesn't matter what you do if people lose trust and they think that you're not going to listen to them at the end of the day and incorporate their feedback. So this is kind of a summary of the state I see in terms of evidence-based decision-making in conservation today. It's now both qualitative and quantitative data. It's more equitable and inclusive. It's based on relationships and trust, which does mean we slow down a little bit in the beginning to have more impact. It's around collective impact and coalitions and groups of people working together around the same goal. And it's still, at the end of the day, based on informed decisions. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. All right. Well, with that, we have some time for questions from the audience. So anything that anybody would like to ask either of our speakers, we'd be happy to have them answer. And we have about we got about 10, 15 minutes for questions, so we've got time to take questions from multiple members of the audience. And so, okay, let me pass a microphone out, and then we'll just have this microphone circulate around the room.
Elizabeth, you mentioned that in 2010, 2012, there was some kind of a shift to thinking in more of a landscape mindset. What was it that caused that shift to occur?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. It's we were focusing so much of history was focusing on this one species in this one place, and instead of focusing on the bigger picture, and that's exactly a little bit of what I was explaining. This landscape conservation approach is trying to get the full picture and realizing that if we're conserving these multiple parcels, these corridors, then you're going to inevitably be conserving and having the biggest lift for multiple species. So it was very a big shift in understanding of how we want to complete that work.
And I guess a question that I really have personally is, when I was an undergraduate student, I had no idea I wanted to work in anything remotely related to the environment, and now find myself being an environmental economist. It sounds like, Nicole, you weren't necessarily sure that's the route you wanted to go down, and Elizabeth, it sounded maybe similar as well. Can you both speak to, I guess it sounds like, Nicole, for you that transition happened in that study abroad program, but was it really cemented at that point, or was there additional coursework that you took that really changed your mind?
Yeah, I think I went into at Denison knowing that I wanted to do biology, but I didn't know what that meant. I mean, obviously, when you just say a degree in biology, that's hundreds of different things that you can do. So I think when I started to narrow it down, just different classes in school, I knew I wanted to do more of an environmental approach or more of an ecological approach, and sort of just start to try and narrow down that path. And then when I was decided to do that abroad program, it did cement the concepts of how important and the different ways that we're approaching our conservation to our environment. And it was very marine based, and my grads program was very marine science based and marine biology based, and that was more the approach, the path that I wanted to go down. But I think, yeah, so it was definitely around that time, but it took a while. I mean, it might take a little trial and error. I mean, like I was saying, it just sort of keeping your mind open to what might be different programs that you might not think you might enjoy at first might be the really important ones. So.
Yeah, I went to college and didn't know what I wanted my major to be, and thank goodness I decided to do a study abroad sophomore year, because similarly, I was inspired by my study abroad. I did an ecology program in Venezuela, and it was after that I switched to the environmental studies major. So I've known all along I wanted to focus on the environment. From that moment on, I've been doing sustainability and environment for 25 years, but it's within that it still takes time to figure out what your focus is. So like, I started off as a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras, working with coffee farmers. Then I got a sustainability job in green manufacturing, and I did inventory management. And then I went to grad school, and I thought I was going to go more on the ag side, like the sustainability side for agriculture. But there were more jobs in environmental economics. And so you can know what you care about, but there's still flexibility within the path.
I think it's a really freeing mindset to know that you don't have to know exactly what you're going to do, exactly what type of career you're going to have when you're 22, and that you can explore different career paths as long as you know your values and know what's important to you. Great. Is there a microphone? Does Clem? Perfect.
Wait. Oh, perfect. All right. I wanted to know if I could ask each of the panelists a different question, if that's okay. All right, perfect. Beginning with Nicole, I remember you said you studied in Guam, and you were noting how, when you said you were studying in Guam, people are like, what is Guam? There are many of those sort of U.S. territories, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Could you illuminate any sort of additional challenges, that those sort of territories face with sort of a lot of Americans not even associating them as a part of the country?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, sad to say, but I think in terms of federal, thinking about so much of what they will rely on is federal funding, whether that's from NOAA or other different federal programs. It's a lot of NOAA dollars go to our territories, especially because those are marine. And I speak from a marine standpoint, because that was the majority of my work from there. It's sad to say, I think that they get forgotten about because they are territories, and as been the case for centuries. They kind of do get forgotten about and do get sort of put on the back burner in terms of priorities from a federal standpoint and federal dollars. So it's challenging, and I think what you come to see though is a more sort of centered resilience on what the people can do there and what they can accomplish, and so realizing that you're not going to get a lot of help from your government, and so it's like, what can we do for ourselves? How can we sustain ourselves? And so the people are incredibly resilient in terms of finding ways to have sustainability and to have conservation work and doing it themselves and finding those practices and also the researchers. Like I said, I worked with Dr. Larry Mindo. She's phenomenal. All of the researchers at the university are very self-sufficient in terms of, and I think professors can talk about that as a whole, but like, being able to get your grant funds, secure that funding and get that for your students to be able to do that work, it's a lot of self-reliance, so.
And for Elizabeth, I wanted to ask, so you talked about how there was sort of a shift sort of in recent years with equity and like equity and inclusion. And I must say I've been a bit spooked in sort of the current political climate, not only at sort of removal of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, but also how, the current administration campaigned on removing those programs, and it seems like them campaigning on removing those programs has led to them being very successful. So sort of given kind of a more hostile political climate towards sort of both the ideals and the implementation of equity and inclusion, where do you see kind of those types of programs, specifically with the disparities you noted in places like Cleveland kind of going into sort of the future?
Well, unfortunately, lack of equity and racism has always been there in conservation. We have a history of that, and I think some of that just comes from the fact that there have always been scarce resources, and so it's kind of triggered that competition for resources and that exclusion. And so it really was only the murder of George Floyd that led some conservation nonprofits to finally realize that they have to talk about that history of racism. So that's definitely why it became more prominent in recent years. I have some colleagues who work on equity and conservation, and what they are saying is, we're not going to change our work, but we are going to change the words we use. So maybe we shift to talking about accessibility. Maybe we shift to talking about all people, making sure we're distributing the benefits to all people. So it is a stressful time, and I appreciate the question. And there are no easy answers, but we're not going to stop doing this work. We just might shift our messaging a little.
All right, thank you so much.
So thinking about how we talked about the barriers in this space, do you think that increasing scientific literacy, especially environmental literacy, will be important in building these community relationships that you spoke about?
That's one of the most frequent questions I get. Everybody thinks that environmental education and scientific literacy is the solution, and I would say yes, and I think it's just one small piece of the puzzle. I think that's why I keep coming back to it's the relationship, and it's talking to their communities and seeing what they care about and including them in the process. If you're not having that community-based collaborative approach, then education alone isn't going to work. It has to be a both and.
Thank you both for your talks. I really found them very interesting. I appreciate them. Speaking also of the current climate, what suggestions do you have? Because I totally agree with building relationships of trust, but that is incredibly difficult with the amount of misinformation and disinformation about environmental issues specifically that is circulating in the social media ecosystem. And it's discouraging to me if we are trying to talk about an environmental problem and then social media or a news outlet kind of contradicts exactly what your program is trying to accomplish, or basically says it's a hoax or that type of thing. So what kinds of things are you doing to counter that kind of misinformation and disinformation?
I mean, I think it's about coalition building. So by by chance, I've had 3 big projects over the past month. So I've talked to about 300 people, and I've gone to 14 focus groups, all with people who care about the environment. So during this time period where it's easy to despair because there's so much misinformation out there, I've had the privilege to talk to so many people who care still. And that is the way you do it. One at a time, you bring together groups, and then you expand that group, and then you have 2 different networks, and you connect those 2 different networks. And it's through that collective voice that we are going to get through this.
Well, we have time for one more question if anyone from the audience would like to ask a question. There's one that's actually been on my mind, though, as a professor and thinking about your career paths. And so this was triggered in part by Nicole's presentation, but I'm also very curious to hear Elizabeth's take as well. If you had to recommend one skill set that you think an undergraduate student could pick up in a course that could help them in their career to protect the environment in an efficient way, what skill set, and this could be something like GIS, as I saw in Nicole's presentation, that, like you said, is new to you, but doesn't have to be technical. It could be a mindset or just an understanding that they could pick up in a course. What would it be?
I think I might kind of echo a little bit of what Elizabeth has said, is that learning how we talk about the work that we need to do, and this is kind of related to the previous question as well, is how we talk to people about what's going on in the environment, the problems that we're facing, why we're doing that, why we find it important to address these issues. I found early on in my career, like I was very super research focused and like numbers and stats and very keeping it sort of one-minded, and that's very important. But this is, and I think this kind of goes in that history timeline as well, of like how we can translate that to the greater society, to the layman, to be able to get them to understand and get them to feel that is important. Us as scientists, we know why it's important. We know why we're doing. Like, we don't have to convince ourselves. We don't have to convince the rest of the greater conservation community. But it's being able to sort of tone that down and say it in easily understandable words to get that message across. Because if we're just talking stats and numbers, it's scary and people don't want to listen. And so being able to effectively communicate not only to your peers, but also to your community, I think is invaluable. And that communications approach, I don't think was often emphasized enough in my schooling and early on in my career. And it was only later when I was trying to do that coalition building and trying to build those networks and trying to get that community buy-in and build that community trust. It's really difficult unless you can learn to communicate and get them on board. So it's learning to do both a little bit, and it's challenging, but it's invaluable.
I 100% agree with that answer. I second that. I will add, it tends to be good to specialize in the environmental field and then go broader later. So I don't think it matters whether you specialize in GIS or economic analysis or something else, but specializing early and going broader later is usually a good path. And I'm going to cheat and throw in a second one. At this point in my career, I have found myself saying a lot that anything you can do to be a better human also makes you a better economist. So anything you can do for personal and leadership development will help you be more successful. And that is because it's so complex and collaborative. It is about managing people.
I think that's a really great way to end it, and unfortunately we are out of time. But I would like to extend one last round of thank yous to everyone for their participation in today's event. Hopefully we're all leaving this room a little more hopeful about the great work that can still be done to support the environment in this time of uncertainty and budget and resource constraints. So thank you to our speakers, thank you to the audience, thank you to the Walton Mata Center, and to everybody.